That sound, the grinding of treads on stone, echoed across the French farmland like the approach of mechanical predators. Private William Hargrove pressed his back against the crumbling wall of what had once been a grain silo. His hands were covered in rust and dried blood, not his blood. Not yet. Just 30 feet away, 2 Panzer III tanks rolled through the wheat field, their turrets scanning for targets. Behind them, German infantry advanced in disciplined formation. Hargrove clutched his creation, a contraption that looked more like agricultural equipment than a weapon of war. His commanding officer had called it the most idiotic thing to come out of this entire bloody disaster. The other men in his platoon had laughed. Some had refused to help him build it. Now those men were scattered across the retreat line, desperately trying to reach the beaches at Dunkirk. And Hargrove was alone with 2 German tanks bearing down on his position. What happened in the next 30 seconds would change everything anyone thought they knew about improvised warfare. But to understand why a blacksmith's son from Yorkshire was hiding behind a French silo with a homemade barbed-wire catapult, we need to go back 3 weeks, to the moment when the entire British Expeditionary Force realized they were about to be wiped off the face of Europe. If you're fascinated by these forgotten stories of battlefield innovation, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. History is filled with moments like this, moments when one person's desperate idea changed the course of a battle. Now let's continue. May 1940. The German Wehrmacht had executed Fall Gelb, Case Yellow, with devastating precision. Their armored divisions had punched through the Ardennes, a region the Allied commanders had believed impassable for tanks. The French defensive strategy collapsed almost overnight, and the British Expeditionary Force found itself trapped, cut off from supply lines, with the German army closing in from 3 directions. William Hargrove was not a typical soldier. Before the war, he had worked in his father's blacksmith shop in Leeds, specializing in agricultural machinery repairs. He understood metal. He understood tension. He understood how mechanical things could be made to fail. When he received his conscription papers in early 1940, he was assigned to the Royal Engineers, a logical placement given his technical background. But nothing in his training had prepared him for what he encountered in France. The retreat began in chaos. British units fell back from position to position, desperately trying to slow the German advance, while the evacuation at Dunkirk was organized. Hargrove's engineering section was tasked with destroying bridges and laying obstacles. They worked around the clock, sleeping in ditches, eating when they could find food. But no matter how many bridges they demolished, the Germans kept coming. Their tanks seemed unstoppable, rolling over trenches, crushing barricades, shrugging off small arms fire as if it were rain. It was during one of these exhausting nights that Hargrove had his idea. His unit had stopped near an abandoned farm, and while the other men collapsed into sleep, he couldn't rest. His mind kept returning to a problem that seemed impossible to solve. How could infantry stop a tank without anti-tank weapons? The British Expeditionary Force had left most of its heavy equipment behind during the retreat. Anti-tank guns were scarce. Ammunition was running low. What they did have in abundance was barbed wire. Rolls and rolls of it, originally intended for defensive positions that would never be built. Hargrove stared at the coils stacked behind the barn and remembered something his father had told him years ago. His father had been a blacksmith during the Great War, the first one, and had worked near the front lines repairing equipment. He used to tell stories about what happened when tanks rolled through barbed wire entanglements. Most people assumed tanks simply crushed the wire and moved on, but that wasn't always true. The elder Hargrove had seen tanks disabled by wire that became wrapped around their drive wheels and track mechanisms. Not often, but it happened. The wire would snake between the road wheels and the tracks, gradually tightening until the whole system seized. The problem was that defensive wire entanglements were static. Tanks could avoid them or find gaps, But what if the wire could be delivered to the tank? What if you could throw it directly into the mechanism? Hargrove began sketching in the dirt with a stick. The other men thought he had lost his mind. Battle fatigue, they whispered. But Sergeant Thomas Reed, his section leader, recognized something in the private's eyes. Not madness, obsession. The kind of obsession that either gets men killed or wins medals. Reed gave Hargrove permission to experiment, as long as it didn't interfere with their primary duties. Over the next 4 days, while the retreat continued, Hargrove scavenged materials. He found metal pipes in bombed-out farmhouses, springs from destroyed vehicles, wooden planks from fences, and barbed wire. Always more barbed wire. His first prototype was laughably crude. It was essentially a large slingshot mounted on a wooden frame designed to launch a compressed bundle of wire at a target. The launching mechanism used thick rubber bands cut from truck tires, similar to the principles that French soldiers had used in the trenches of the previous war to launch grenades. When Hargrove tested it against a barn wall, the wire bundle fell apart in midair and scattered harmlessly across the ground. The other soldiers watched with a mixture of pity and contempt. "Stick to your shovel, Hargrove," one of them called out. "Leave the weapons to people who know what they're doing." But failure didn't discourage Hargrove. It informed him. The problem wasn't the launching mechanism, it was the ammunition. Barbed wire, by its nature, wanted to expand. The barbs caught on everything. He needed a way to keep the wire compressed until it hit the target, then have it expand explosively into the tank's running gear. The solution came from an unlikely source: burlap sacks and spring-loaded release pins. Hargrove designed a wire bundle wrapped in burlap, held together by thin wire that would break on impact. Inside the bundle, he compressed approximately 40 feet of standard military barbed wire into a package roughly the size of a large melon. When the bundle hit a hard surface, the burlap tore, the retaining wire snapped, and the barbed wire expanded outward with significant force, directly into whatever mechanism it landed on. He modified the launcher as well. The slingshot design was abandoned in favor of something more powerful: a torsion-based catapult using twisted rope made from truck cables. The design was similar to ancient siege weapons, but miniaturized. It could be operated by 2 men and assembled in under 10 minutes from components that fit in a standard backpack. The second test was more promising. The wire bundle held together during launch flew approximately 60 yards and expanded on impact with a satisfying violence. The barbed strands spread across a 15-foot radius, tangling in the undergrowth and fence posts. But Sergeant Reed wasn't convinced. "That's all well and good against a fence post," he said. "How's it going to stop a 30-ton tank?" "It won't stop it immediately," Hargrove admitted, "but it doesn't have to. If the wire gets into the track mechanism, between the road wheels and the track links, it'll create friction. The more the track moves, the tighter the wire wins. Eventually, something will seize or break." Reed looked skeptical. "Eventually isn't going to help if the tank's machine gun cuts you in half first. That's why we need to hit them from the side or rear. The driver's vision is limited. If we position correctly, we can get a clean shot at the running gear before they know we're there." It was a theory, an untested, possibly insane theory. But in the chaos of the retreat, theory was all they had. The opportunity to test it came 3 days later, near the village of Wormhout. Hargrove's section had been separated from the main column during a German air attack. 5 men armed with rifles and 1 Bren gun found themselves isolated behind enemy lines. They took shelter in a farmhouse and waited for darkness, hoping to slip through German positions and rejoin the retreat. Then they heard the tanks. 2 Panzer IIIs approached from the east, moving slowly along a farm road, their infantry escort spread out behind them. The Germans were conducting a sweep looking for stragglers like Hargrove's group. If they reached the farmhouse, the 5 British soldiers would be discovered. Fighting was not an option. Their weapons were useless against armor, and they were outnumbered at least 4-1. Hargrove grabbed his catapult. "You can't be serious," Private Morrison hissed. "That thing is going to get us all killed." "We're already dead if we don't do something," Hargrove replied. "Give me covering fire when I tell you. Aim at the infantry, keep their heads down." Sergeant Reed made a decision. In the desperate arithmetic of war, sometimes the only winning move is the one nobody expects. "Do it," he said. "Morrison, Jenkins, get to the upper windows. Henderson, you're with me at the Bren. Hargrove, you've got one shot at this. Make it count." They took positions. Hargrove moved to the side of the barn where he had a clear line of sight to the road. The tanks were about 100 yards away, rumbling closer. He could see the iron crosses painted on their turrets, the faces of the commanders standing in their hatches. Behind them, German soldiers advanced in a loose formation, rifles at the ready. Hargrove's hands trembled as he assembled the catapult. The wooden frame clicked together. The torsion cables wound tight. He placed the wire bundle, his last one, into the launching cradle and drew back the release mechanism. 60 yards. That was his maximum effective range. He had to let them get close, dangerously close. The lead tank passed a broken cart. 50 yards. Hargrove could hear the squeak of its tracks, the rumble of its engine. The infantry were fanning out, checking buildings on either side of the road. One of them was heading toward the farmhouse. 40 yards. The German soldier reached the farmhouse door. "Now," Hargrove whispered. The Bren gun opened up. The German at the door fell. His comrades scattered, diving for cover. The infantry escort was suddenly engaged in a firefight, their attention drawn away from the tanks. The tank commanders dropped into their vehicles and buttoned up the hatches. The lead Panzer's turret began to rotate toward the farmhouse. In seconds, its 50-millimeter gun would reduce the building to rubble. Hargrove pulled the release. The catapult's arm snapped forward with a violence that nearly knocked him off his feet. The wire bundle arced through the air, a dark shape against the gray sky, and struck the side of the lead tank just behind the turret. The burlap shredded. The retaining wires broke, and 40 feet of military-grade barbed wire exploded outward, draping across the tank's hull, trailing down into the running gear on the left side. For a moment, nothing happened. The tank continued forward. Hargrove's heart sank. Then the sound changed. The smooth rumble of the tracks became a grinding screech. The wire, caught in the track mechanism, had begun to wind around the drive sprocket. With each rotation, more wire was pulled in, the track tension increased. The road wheels, now dragged by twisted metal, began to resist. The tank lurched, its left track locked, while its right track continued to move, causing the vehicle to spin sharply. The driver, confused, tried to correct, but overcorrecting with a stuck track only made things worse. The tank veered off the road and ground to a halt, its engine screaming against the resistance. 14 seconds had passed since Hargrove's shot. The second tank, following close behind, swerved to avoid its disabled companion. In doing so, it drove directly over the trailing strands of wire that had spilled across the road, the barbs caught in its own track links. Not as much wire as the first tank, but enough. The second Panzer's track began to slip, losing traction on the muddy road. The tank commander tried to reverse to pull free of the entanglement, but backing up pulled more wire into the mechanism. The vehicle shuddered, its engine straining. Then, with a sharp crack that echoed across the field, something in the drive system broke. The left track went completely slack, sliding off the drive sprocket. 28 seconds. 2 tanks disabled. The German infantry, caught between the firefight at the farmhouse and their immobilized armor, began to fall back. They didn't know what had hit their tanks, they couldn't see the wire in the confusion, and the uncertainty was terrifying. This was supposed to be a simple sweep against scattered stragglers, not an anti-tank ambush. Sergeant Reed seized the moment. "Move! Now!" The 5 British soldiers abandoned the farmhouse and sprinted for the tree line to the west. German bullets snapped past them, but the infantry was disorganized, their fire inaccurate. The tank crews, trapped in their disabled vehicles, couldn't pursue. Hargrove ran with his empty catapult frame bouncing against his back. His legs burned, his lungs screamed for air, but he was alive. They were all alive. They reached the woods and kept moving, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the German position. Behind them, they could hear the sound of more vehicles arriving, recovery trucks, probably, sent to retrieve the damaged tanks. It wasn't until they stopped to rest 2 hours later that the reality of what had happened sank in. Morrison sat down heavily on a fallen log and stared at Hargrove. "That actually worked," he said. "Your stupid wire catapult actually worked." Hargrove didn't know what to say. His hands were still shaking. He had designed the weapon based on theory and desperate hope. Seeing it succeed, seeing those tanks grind to a halt, felt like a miracle. Or maybe it was just physics. Wire plus track mechanism plus enough force equaled disabled tank. Simple when you thought about it. But it had worked. Against all odds, against all mockery, it had worked. The 5 men reached British lines 2 days later, slipping through German positions under cover of darkness. Dunkirk was in its final chaotic hours. They were among the last soldiers evacuated before the perimeter collapsed. Back in England, Hargrove reported his invention to his commanding officers. The initial reaction was skepticism, the same skepticism he had faced from his own platoon. A wire catapult against tanks. It sounded like desperation, which it was, but desperation didn't make it effective. The military bureaucracy moved slowly, as military bureaucracies do. Hargrove's report was filed, reviewed, and ultimately buried under the avalanche of other pressing concerns. Britain was preparing for invasion. There was no time to investigate the claims of a single private about a homemade anti-armor weapon. But the idea didn't die. Other soldiers, facing the same desperate circumstances, came to similar conclusions. The need for improvised anti-tank weapons was acute. The Home Guard, formed in the aftermath of Dunkirk, had almost nothing with which to fight German armor. Inventors and engineers across Britain began developing their own solutions. Some of these weapons became famous or infamous. Major Robert Harry Northover, a Home Guard officer, designed the Northover projector, a simple metal tube that could launch phosphorus grenades at tanks. Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Blacker created the Blacker Bombard, a spigot mortar that could throw 20-pound anti-tank bombs about 100 yards. Neither weapon was particularly effective against actual tanks, but both represented the same desperate ingenuity that had driven Hargrove's wire catapult. The sticky bomb, officially the number 74 ST grenade, was another product of this period. Designed to adhere to tank armor before exploding, it was notoriously dangerous to its users, often sticking to the soldier's hand or clothing instead of the target. More than 2.5 million were manufactured anyway, because the alternative was having nothing at all. These improvised weapons shared a common philosophy: use whatever was available to create what was urgently needed, regardless of how crude it looked. They were born from desperation, refined through trial and error, and deployed with the understanding that they might not work, but doing something was better than doing nothing. Hargrove's wire catapult never entered mass production. The concept was studied by military engineers, who found it interesting but impractical for large-scale deployment. The ammunition was difficult to manufacture consistently. The range was too short. The accuracy depended heavily on the operator's skill, and by the time these assessments were complete, better anti-tank weapons had become available: Piats, anti-tank rifles, and eventually the American-made bazookas that would give infantry a reliable way to fight armor. But the story didn't end there. In 1941, Hargrove was transferred to the newly formed Special Operations Executive, the organization tasked with sabotage and unconventional warfare in occupied Europe. His technical skills and his proven ability to improvise under pressure made him valuable for missions that required creativity as much as courage. He was sent to Yugoslavia in 1943, where partisan forces were fighting a brutal guerrilla war against German occupation. The partisans had weapons, but they had almost no anti-tank capability. German armored columns could move through partisan territory with near impunity, destroying villages and supply depots. Hargrove taught them his wire trick. The concept was adapted to local conditions. Instead of barbed wire, which was scarce in the Yugoslavian mountains, the partisans used heavy steel cable scavenged from logging operations. Instead of catapults, they devised tripwire-triggered spring mechanisms that would fling cable coils at passing vehicles. The triggers were hidden in the road surface, activated by the weight of a tank passing over them. The first successful ambush occurred near the town of Ujice in September 1943. A German supply convoy, escorted by 2 Panzer IV tanks, was moving through a narrow mountain pass. The partisans had prepared their trap over 3 days, burying cable coils along a 200-yard stretch of road. When the lead tank hit the first trigger, a 20-pound coil of steel cable exploded from concealment and wrapped around its left track. The tank slewed sideways, partially blocking the road. The second tank, trying to push past, triggered 2 more traps. Within 90 seconds, both vehicles were immobilized, and the infantry escort was caught in a crossfire from partisan positions on the ridges above. The Germans lost 14 men and 2 tanks in an engagement that cost the partisans nothing. More importantly, the convoy's supplies, fuel, ammunition, and medical equipment were captured intact. Word spread. Partisan units across Yugoslavia began adapting the technique. German commanders, initially dismissive of reports about wire traps, were forced to acknowledge a new threat to their armored operations. Convoys began moving more slowly, preceded by infantry patrols checking for tripwires. This slowed their operational tempo significantly, exactly what the partisans wanted. The Germans countered by adding wire-cutting teams to their advance elements and fitting their tanks with improvised brush guards to deflect cable before it could reach the tracks. The partisans responded by using heavier cable and adding hooks that would catch on the guards themselves. It was an arms race, fought with salvaged materials and rural ingenuity. Neither side ever gained a decisive advantage, but that wasn't the point. The point was to make German armor vulnerable, to prove that tanks were not invincible, that determined fighters with improvised weapons could challenge the might of the Wehrmacht. Hargrove served in Yugoslavia until mid-1944, when he was extracted for reassignment to France in preparation for Operation Overlord. His wire trap technique was documented in SOE training materials and disseminated to resistance movements across occupied Europe. Similar concepts appeared in French Maquis operations and Dutch resistance activities during the final year of the war. After the war, Hargrove returned to civilian life. He went back to Leeds, took over his father's blacksmith business, and rarely spoke about his military service. The wire catapult became a footnote in the history of improvised warfare, mentioned occasionally in specialized military publications, but unknown to the general public. That changed in 1978, when a military historian named Jeffrey Williams discovered Hargrove's original after-action reports while researching a book about the Dunkirk evacuation. Williams tracked down the aging veteran, now 70 years old, still working in his forge, and conducted a series of interviews that would become the definitive account of the wire catapult's development and deployment. In the published book, Williams asked Hargrove what had driven him to create such an unconventional weapon. The old soldier's answer was characteristically modest. "We didn't have anything else," Hargrove said. "The tanks were coming, and we had wire. So I thought about what wire could do to a tank. It wasn't genius. It was just paying attention to what you've got and what you need to make it do." When asked about the soldiers who had mocked his invention, Hargrove smiled slightly. "They were right to laugh," he admitted. "It was a stupid-looking thing, Still worked, though. Williams pressed him on how it felt to see his creation succeed in combat, to watch those 2 German tanks grind to a halt, because of something he had built with his own hands. Hargrove was quiet for a long moment before responding. "I didn't feel proud," he finally said. "I felt relieved. We were going to die, and then we didn't. That's all I was thinking about. Everything else came later." Williams titled his chapter on Hargrove, "The Blacksmith's War," a reference to both his civilian trade and the improvised nature of his weapon. The book received modest attention when published and introduced Hargrove's story to a wider audience for the first time. But for Hargrove himself, there was one more chapter. In 1982, the United Kingdom went to war again, this time over a group of wind-swept islands in the South Atlantic. The Falklands War saw British forces facing Argentine armor under conditions that sometimes echoed the desperate improvisations of 1940. When asked by a journalist whether he had any advice for British soldiers, the 84-year-old Hargrove offered a simple observation. "Every machine has a weakness," he said. "Find it, exploit it, that's all." He passed away 3 years later, in 1985, working in his forge until the final weeks of his life. His obituary in the Leeds newspaper mentioned his war service only in passing, served with distinction in France and Yugoslavia, without any reference to the invention that had saved his life and inspired a generation of unconventional warriors. The wire catapult itself has never been forgotten by military historians. It appears in studies of improvised anti-tank warfare as an example of how infantry can exploit the mechanical vulnerabilities of armored vehicles. Modern equivalents exist: rapidly deployable cable obstacles, wire entanglement systems designed for helicopter delivery, all of which trace their conceptual lineage back to the desperate calculations of a blacksmith's son hiding behind a French grain silo. The legacy extends beyond military application. Hargrove's story illustrates a fundamental principle of innovation under pressure. Constraints force creativity. When you don't have what you need, you find ways to make what you have work. This principle applies to business, to engineering, to any field where resources are limited and problems are urgent. It also demonstrates the importance of physical understanding, of knowing how things actually work, not just how they're supposed to work. Hargrove succeeded because he understood metal, tension, and mechanical failure in ways that more formally educated soldiers did not. His knowledge came from years of hands-on work, from fixing broken machinery and building things that had to function in the real world. Most importantly, the wire catapult story challenges the assumption that inferior forces are helpless against superior technology. The German panzers of 1940 represented the cutting edge of armored warfare. They had defeated Poland in weeks, crushed France in months, and seemed destined to dominate the continent. But they could still be stopped by barbed wire in the right place, by a simple weapon wielded by a determined soldier who understood that even the most powerful machine has its vulnerabilities. This lesson resonates through the decades. From the improvised explosive devices of modern insurgencies to the jury-rigged defenses of outmatched armies everywhere, the principle remains constant. Technology is not destiny. Human ingenuity, applied at the point of need, can always find a way. The tanks that rolled toward William Hargrove on that French road in 1940 were operated by trained crews, supported by combined arms doctrine and backed by the industrial might of Nazi Germany. They should have been unstoppable. Instead, they were stopped by 40 feet of wire launched from a contraption that looked, as one of Hargrove's fellow soldiers observed, like something from a medieval siege crossed with a particularly angry farmer. That contraption, stupid-looking, dismissed, mocked, disabled 2 tanks in 30 seconds and changed one small corner of the war. It was built from scrap materials by a man who had never attended military academy, never studied engineering formally, and never claimed to be anything more than a blacksmith who paid attention. The soldiers who laughed at Hargrove's wire catapult weren't wrong to be skeptical. Skepticism is healthy. Unconventional ideas fail more often than they succeed. But sometimes, in the desperate mathematics of survival, the unconventional idea is the only one you have. And sometimes, just sometimes, it works. The sound of those German tanks grinding to a halt echoed through William Hargrove's memory for the rest of his life. Not as a triumph, but as a reminder. A reminder that when everything else fails, when the enemy is stronger and better equipped and closing in fast, there is still always something you can do. Find the weakness, exploit it, that's all. The wire is still there, rusting in the soil of that French field, tangled in the mechanisms of tanks that were eventually recovered and scrapped. But the idea, the principle, that wire represents never rusted, never faded. It passed from soldier to partisan to resistance fighter to modern military theorist, carried by the simple truth that William Hargrove discovered on the worst day of his life. Every machine has a weakness, even the ones that seem invincible, even the ones rolling toward you right now.